My sister-in-law tricked my husband into thinking our kids aren't his, and now she's telling everyone at church that I'm a fraud. When I confronted her, she claimed she was protecting him. So, my husband Michael, 36M, and I, 34F, have been together for almost a decade, married for 7 years, and have 2 wonderful kids, Lily, 5, and Max, 3. We've built a life together that I'm proud of, but apparently someone else wasn't too thrilled about our happiness. My sister-in-law, Linda, 38F. Linda has always been, let's say, intense. She's fiercely protective of Michael, which I initially admired. But over time, it became clear that she had a tendency to interfere in ways that crossed the line. I tolerated it because, well, family is complicated, and Michael is close to her. I wanted to keep the peace for his sake, so I let a lot slide. But recently, things have taken a turn that I never saw coming. It all started when I noticed Michael acting strange, distant, suspicious, even a little cold. At first, I chalked it up to stress. He's been under a lot of pressure at work, and he's always been the type to internalize his stress rather than talk about it. But then I overheard him on the phone, and he sounded almost angry, frustrated, and he was saying things that didn't make any sense, things about trust, betrayal, and lies. My stomach dropped, and I knew something was seriously wrong. When I confronted him about it, he just clammed up, wouldn't even look me in the eye. He told me that he needed some space, that he needed time to process something, but he refused to tell me what it was. The distance between us grew, and it was like a stranger had replaced the man I married. I was losing my mind, wondering what could have caused this. My mind went to dark places, and I started questioning everything, wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I was somehow the cause of his sudden change. Then, one Sunday after church, I found out the horrible truth. My friend Sarah pulled me aside, looking extremely uncomfortable. She said she didn't know how to tell me this, but Linda had been spreading rumors about me, saying that I'd been unfaithful, that our children weren't Michael's. I felt a rush of heat and anger, my heart pounding as Sarah told me that Linda was telling people she had proof that I'd been seeing other men, that she was only looking out for her brother. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. This was a woman who had been in my home, who had held my children, who I'd tried to include in our lives despite her constant meddling. And now she was trying to destroy my family. I couldn't wrap my head around it, but I knew I had to confront Michael immediately. I had to hear from him whether he actually believed this garbage. When I got home, I found him sitting on the couch, looking absolutely devastated. I asked him directly, "Do you believe what Linda is saying?" He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes, a doubt that broke my heart. He admitted that Linda had been feeding him lies for weeks, telling him that she'd seen me with other men, that she had a friend who worked at a clinic who confirmed that the paternity results for Lily and Max didn't match his DNA. He said he hadn't wanted to believe it, but Linda had been so convincing, so insistent that she was protecting him from being hurt. I felt a mix of anger and despair. How could he believe her? How could he think I would ever do something like that to him? But when I looked at him, I saw just how torn he was, just how deep Linda's poison had seeped. She had played on his worst fears, his insecurities, and I could see that he didn't know what to believe anymore. I took a deep breath, fighting back tears, and told him I was willing to do a DNA test right then and there to prove my loyalty, to show him that Linda was lying. But I also told him that his willingness to believe her over me, to let her poison our family, was something that would need to be addressed. I could see him grappling with his guilt, with the realization that he had let his sister plant seeds of doubt in his mind. He agreed to the test, and I knew that regardless of the results, our relationship had taken a hit that wouldn't easily heal. The next morning, I scheduled a DNA test for both kids and myself, making sure it would be handled as quickly as possible. Michael looked uncomfortable, but agreed to come with us. We didn't speak much on the drive to the clinic. The silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension and resentment that Linda had managed to create. I could see the guilt on his face, but it didn't ease the ache in my chest. How had it come to this, where I had to prove the legitimacy of our children? After the tests were done, they told us it would take a few days for the results. Those days were some of the longest and most agonizing I've ever experienced. Michael and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was tense and strained. I kept thinking about how Linda had managed to do this, how she had planted these horrible seeds of doubt, and how Michael had let her manipulate him. The worst part? Linda wasn't done. She called Michael daily, checking in on him, acting like she was his only ally in the world. I could hear her voice through the phone, oozing false concern as she told him that he deserved better, that he shouldn't have to be in a marriage based on lies. She kept fueling the fire, twisting the knife deeper, and I could see that Michael was struggling, torn between loyalty to his sister and the trust he once had in me. Finally, the day of the test results arrived. I barely slept the night before, anxiety twisting my stomach. Michael and I drove to the clinic in silence, and when we arrived, they handed us an envelope with the results. He opened it, his hands shaking, and as he read the results, I saw the relief wash over his face. The test confirmed that he was the father of both Lily and Max, just as I knew he would be. I expected an apology, some acknowledgement of the pain he put me through, the humiliation of having to go to these lengths to prove my fidelity. But instead, he looked down, mumbling about how he shouldn't have let Linda get to him. It wasn't nearly enough, but I was too drained to press him further at that moment. I just wanted this nightmare to be over. But Linda had other plans. When Michael told her the results, she didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down, saying that I must have somehow faked the test, that I had connections at the clinic, and that it was all part of a larger scheme to trap Michael in a marriage built on lies. I couldn't believe the lengths she was willing to go to discredit me, even after the test proved her accusations false. Michael tried to cut her off, telling her she needed to stop, but she just kept at it, accusing him of being blinded by love, of ignoring the obvious. She even went so far as to suggest that he get a second test from a different clinic. I felt like I was living in a twisted nightmare, where no amount of evidence or truth could break through Linda's web of lies. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the phone from Michael, my hands shaking with anger, and I told Linda that she needed to stay out of our lives, that her obsession with tearing us apart was sick, and that I wouldn't stand for it anymore. I told her that if she didn't stop her slander, I'd be taking legal action for defamation. She laughed, saying I wouldn't dare, that I was too afraid of what people would think if this whole thing became public. But I didn't care anymore. I was done playing nice. I hung up and looked at Michael, who seemed stunned by the whole exchange. I told him that he needed to choose. Either he stood by me and our children, or he continued to let his sister manipulate him. I wasn't going to keep defending myself against someone so hell-bent on destroying our family. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between loyalty to his sister and the guilt of what he put me through. Finally, he nodded, saying he would cut ties with Linda until she got help. The days that followed were tense. Michael and I worked on rebuilding trust, but it wasn't easy. The scars from Linda's accusations ran deep, and I could feel the damage she'd done to our marriage, like a crack in a foundation couldn't be easily repaired. We tried counseling, hoping to mend the wounds, but I still felt that lingering bitterness, the sting of betrayal every time I looked at him. Just as I thought things were settling down, Linda upped the ante. She started spreading more lies at church, telling everyone that I'd manipulated Michael into cutting her out of his life, that I was a fraud who used underhanded tactics to isolate him. People began whispering, and I felt the cold, judgmental stares whenever we attended service. My anger and frustration grew as I realized that Linda wasn't going to stop until she'd completely ruined my reputation. I confronted Michael, telling him that we needed to take action, that we couldn't let her keep dragging us through the mud. He agreed, and we decided to speak with our pastor, hoping to clear the air and put an end to Linda's campaign of lies. But when we arrived, we found out that Linda had already met with him, spinning her tale of being a concerned sister, only trying to save her brother from a toxic marriage. I could hardly believe the depths of her deception. The pastor agreed to mediate a meeting between us and Linda, hoping to bring about some reconciliation. But I knew there was no reasoning with her. She was too far gone, too invested in her lies to ever admit the truth. I felt trapped, caught in a web of Linda's making, with no easy way out. It was as if she had taken my life, my family, and twisted it into something unrecognizable, something dark and ugly. The day of the mediation meeting arrived, and I was dreading it with every fiber of my being. I knew this wasn't going to be some heartfelt, tearful reconciliation. Linda had proven time and time again that she was set on one goal: tearing my family apart, no matter what it took. Michael and I had arrived at the church, our pastor waiting for us in his small office with a look of concern. He'd always been kind and understanding, but he seemed unsure of what to expect from this gathering, as though he too sensed the depth of Linda's hostility. We sat in silence for a few minutes, waiting for Linda. When she finally arrived, she wore a smug expression, looking at me with a mix of contempt and pity, as if I were a child who couldn't see the so-called truth of her accusations. The pastor started by asking her why she had made these accusations, encouraging her to speak openly so we could address any misunderstandings. Linda wasted no time. She launched into a tirade, accusing me of manipulating Michael, of being a mastermind who'd somehow deceived him into believing I was loyal. She even threw in some outrageous claims, suggesting I'd alienated him from his family intentionally, isolating him for control. I sat there, my fists clenched, biting my tongue, refusing to let her bait me. I could see Michael becoming visibly uncomfortable, and even the pastor looked taken aback by her venom. Finally, I spoke up. I calmly pointed out that her accusations had no basis, that the DNA test proved Michael was the father of our children, and that I had done nothing but support him throughout our marriage. I told her that her fixation on my marriage was unhealthy, and that for Michael's sake she needed to stop. But Linda just scoffed, rolling her eyes, saying that I could fake any test, lie about anything. She claimed I had no evidence of my loyalty, just words. It was then that I realized this wasn't about Michael, or even our kids. Linda had a personal vendetta against me. She wasn't just trying to save her brother from what she thought was a bad marriage. She was targeting me specifically, driven by something deeper and uglier. I decided it was time to dig a little, to find out why she had such a grudge against me. After the mediation, which ended in a complete disaster, with Linda storming out and calling me every name under the sun, I began looking into her past. I spent hours researching, combing through old records, anything I could find. It wasn't easy, but eventually I stumbled upon something that shook me to my core. I found out that years ago, Linda had been in a long-term relationship that had ended abruptly. Her ex had left her for someone else, someone who'd broken up their relationship. The name of that person? My sister Emily. I was stunned. I'd had no idea that my sister had ever even dated Linda's ex, let alone broken up their relationship. When I called Emily to confirm, she was hesitant, but she eventually admitted it, saying she hadn't thought it was important. It all started to make sense. Linda's hatred wasn't about me, it was about my family. She saw me as an extension of my sister, the woman who had supposedly ruined her life. And now she was projecting that old grudge onto my marriage with Michael. Armed with this new information, I confronted Linda. I found her outside her house, and before she could get a word in, I laid out everything I'd discovered. I told her that I knew about her ex, that I knew why she really hated me, and that this vendetta had nothing to do with Michael. I watched as her face shifted from smugness to shock, then to anger. She stammered, trying to deny it, but the truth was written all over her face. "You've been dragging my family through hell over something that happened years ago," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You tore apart my marriage, humiliated me in front of our entire community, and you did it because of some grudge against my sister. You realize the damage you've caused." Linda's expression twisted with rage, and she yelled that I had no idea what it felt like to have someone take everything away from me, to watch someone else live the life she'd wanted. I realized then that she was so blinded by her bitterness that she couldn't even see the harm she'd inflicted on the people around her. She started throwing insults, screaming that I didn't deserve Michael, that he'd be better off with anyone else. But I wasn't interested in arguing anymore. I told her that I'd be taking legal action if she didn't leave us alone, and I turned and walked away. When I got home, I told Michael everything. He was horrified, both by Linda's actions and by the realization that she'd harbored such a grudge for so long. I could see the pain in his eyes, the guilt and shame for ever having doubted me. He apologized, saying he had no idea that his sister was capable of such cruelty, that he should have stood by me from the beginning. I wanted to forgive him, to accept his apology and start rebuilding our life, but there was a part of me that still felt raw or wounded. The days that followed were tense. Linda didn't stop her campaign. If anything, she escalated it, spreading rumors about me, trying to turn everyone we knew against us. I began to receive anonymous letters, threats accusing me of things I hadn't done, and every day felt like a new battle. It was as if Linda was determined to destroy me, no matter the cost, even if it meant destroying her own brother's happiness in the process. Finally, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. I reached out to my pastor, to friends and family, and I told them everything. I laid out Linda's history, her vendetta, and the truth behind her actions. It wasn't easy, but I needed people to know the truth, to see that I wasn't the villain Linda had painted me to be. Slowly, the tide began to turn. People started to see Linda for what she was, a woman consumed by bitterness, willing to destroy anyone in her path to satisfy her thirst for revenge. Michael and I went to counseling, working to rebuild the trust that Linda had shattered. It was a long, painful process, filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but we were determined to make it work. I knew that healing wouldn't come easily, but for the first time, I felt like we had a chance. We had faced Linda's wrath, exposed the truth, and come out the other side. And as we began to pick up the pieces of our lives, I found myself more resolved than ever to protect my family from anyone who dared to threaten our happiness again. Just as Michael and I started feeling some relief, it was clear that Linda wasn't finished with us. Even after I'd exposed her motivations, she refused to back down. She seemed to have doubled down on her hatred, not just against me, but against the entire idea of our family. Her next move was something I hadn't anticipated. She filed for custody of our children. At first, I thought it was a joke, a cruel, twisted joke, but the legal papers were real. Linda claimed that I was unfit as a mother, alleging that I'd emotionally manipulated my children and even went as far as to accuse me of neglect. She dragged up every minor parenting mistake I'd ever made, twisting them into a narrative of abuse. Her filing included statements from people she'd convinced to lie for her, as well as documents full of fabrications, claiming I had somehow corrupted our children's upbringing. The shock of it hit me hard. I was terrified. She was using the very system that was supposed to protect us against me, twisting it for her own vendetta. And horrifyingly, Michael's initial doubts about our children's paternity, which she had sown, were listed as one of her key arguments. Linda claimed I'd betrayed Michael, bringing our children into a life of deception, and therefore I was unfit to raise them. Michael was beside himself, furious at his sister. I could see the rage and hurt in his eyes, a reflection of my own feelings. He assured me he would testify on my behalf, that he would stand by me no matter what. But I could tell this whole ordeal was tearing him apart. His sister was waging war on our family, and the reality was he was still caught in the middle. It made me worry about what this was doing to him and to us. We lawyered up quickly, preparing for what would likely be a long, grueling custody battle. Linda's case was flimsy, built on lies and distortions, but the threat was real. She had a way of twisting truths, making things appear worse than they were. And she had her allies, the people she had poisoned against me, those who'd bought into her narrative. The thought of facing them in court made my stomach churn, but I had no choice. The first hearing was an emotional nightmare. Linda brought her allies, parading them into the courtroom to spout lie after lie. They claimed to have witnessed disturbing behavior, made up stories of incidents that never happened, and painted me as a villain who had manipulated Michael and kept him isolated from his family. It was gut-wrenching to hear these things about myself, knowing they weren't true, knowing that these people were speaking on behalf of a woman driven by hatred. When it was our turn, Michael took the stand. He spoke with conviction, detailing how Linda had manipulated him, how she had planted seeds of doubt about our children, and how she had tried to turn him against me. He was honest, even admitting that he had initially believed her lies, but that he had seen through them once the DNA test cleared everything up. He described Linda's vendetta, her pattern of control, and the destruction she had wreaked on our marriage. I then took the stand and recounted every cruel act, every slanderous rumor, every attempt she had made to tear our family apart. I spoke of the toll it had taken on me, how it had impacted my mental health, and the fear I felt each day that my children could be taken away because of Linda's lies. I laid bare my pain, my resilience, and my determination to protect my family from her toxic influence. Our lawyer presented evidence that countered each of Linda's claims. We had documentation from friends, neighbors, and teachers who had seen me with my children, who knew the loving relationship we shared. Bit by bit, we chipped away at Linda's case, exposing the lies and highlighting the truth. As I sat there, listening to my own life being dissected in court, I felt a strange sense of relief. I realized that by fighting back, by facing Linda head-on, I was reclaiming my life from her influence. The courtroom battle raged for weeks. Each time Linda came up with a new lie, we countered it with the truth. But the stress was unbearable. I was barely sleeping, my appetite had vanished, and the toll on my family was becoming more apparent each day. My children sensed the tension, and it broke my heart to see them caught up in something they couldn't understand. I did my best to shield them, to keep their lives as normal as possible, but Linda's presence loomed over everything, like a dark cloud that refused to go away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge called us back for the final hearing. It was time for the ruling. I held my breath as the judge reviewed the facts, recounting the case in stark, clinical terms. I felt my heart pounding, each word stretching out as I waited for the verdict that could change my life forever. The judge ruled in our favor. He stated that Linda's claims were baseless, built on malice and vindictiveness, and he condemned her actions as an abuse of the legal system. He not only denied her custody, but placed a restraining order against her, barring her from contacting me or my family in any way. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, a feeling so intense that it left me breathless. We had won. I had protected my children, my family, from Linda's wrath. After the hearing, Michael and I embraced, the weight of the past few months finally lifting. But I knew that this ordeal had changed us both. We were scarred, exhausted, and forever altered by the cruelty we had endured. Linda had succeeded in leaving her mark on our lives, a reminder of how deep-rooted hatred could nearly tear a family apart. But I also knew that we had emerged stronger, bound together by the battles we had fought side by side. We left the courthouse that day, determined to rebuild, to create a life free from Linda's toxic influence. We had faced her wrath, exposed her lies, and reclaimed our family from her twisted grip. And as we walked away, hand in hand, I knew that despite the scars, we would heal. We would move forward together, leaving Linda and her bitterness behind us. The days after the final hearing felt surreal. For the first time in years, I was free from the constant shadow of Linda's manipulations. The weight on my shoulders was lighter, but the scars she left behind were undeniable. Michael and I decided to take some time off from our usual routines to focus on healing and reconnecting as a family. We both knew this wasn't just the end of a battle with Linda, it was a new beginning for us. We decided to take the kids on a trip to the coast, somewhere peaceful where we could escape from the memories of everything that had happened. On our first night there, as we watched the sunset over the ocean, Michael took my hand. He apologized once again, his voice heavy with regret, for ever doubting me, for letting Linda's lies come between us. I could see the guilt in his eyes, and I realized that he'd been carrying his own burden of shame throughout this whole ordeal. "I don't blame you," I said, squeezing his hand. "We were both victims of her lies, but now we're here together. We can start fresh." As the days passed, we found a new rhythm as a family. We laughed, we talked, and for the first time in a long time, we allowed ourselves to dream about the future. We were no longer living under the weight of Linda's influence. I could see the change in our kids too. They seemed lighter, happier, as if they too sensed that a storm had passed. The damage Linda had done wasn't easy to forget. We knew we'd have to continue working to rebuild the trust that had been shaken. Michael suggested we attend couples counseling, not because our relationship was broken, but because we wanted to strengthen the foundation that Linda had tried so hard to destroy. It was hard at first, reliving the memories, confronting the pain, and being brutally honest about our feelings. But in time, it became a space where we could both heal. During one session, Michael opened up about his relationship with Linda, admitting that he'd always felt a sense of obligation to protect her, even when she didn't deserve it. He explained that he'd been blinded by his loyalty, by a sense of familial duty that Linda had taken advantage of for far too long. Hearing him express his anger and resentment was cathartic for both of us. It was as if he was finally breaking free from the chains she'd wrapped around him since childhood. We also worked on rebuilding the relationship with our children. They had seen and heard more than we'd realized, and we wanted to make sure they understood that none of what had happened was their fault. We talked openly with them, answering their questions in a way they could understand, and reassuring them that we were a family, stronger than ever. It was a slow process, but each conversation brought us closer together. Months passed, and the wounds Linda had inflicted began to heal. We stopped looking over our shoulders, stopped expecting her to show up unannounced to twist the knife one last time. Life became more peaceful, and the joy of everyday moments started to return. I found myself smiling more, laughing with my kids, enjoying the simple pleasures that I had taken for granted. Michael and I grew closer than we'd ever been, bonded by the trials we had faced together. One day, as I was going through some old boxes, I came across a letter from Linda, dated years before she had started this campaign of hatred against me. It was a note she had written to me after Michael and I got married, welcoming me to the family. The words were kind, even warm, and I couldn't reconcile the person who wrote them with the woman who had nearly destroyed my life. I realized that Linda had likely never been at peace with herself, that her venom had come from a place of deep-seated insecurity and jealousy. She'd seen Michael's happiness as a threat, a reminder of her own emptiness. It was a sobering thought, but I decided not to dwell on it. I would not let her brokenness define our family's story. She was a part of our past, but that was where she would stay. We moved forward, determined to live fully and without fear. Michael became more involved in our children's lives, making up for the time he'd lost while we were under Linda's influence. We built new memories, took trips together, and celebrated milestones that once seemed impossible. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was more than enough. I had learned a hard lesson through all of this. Family can be both a source of comfort and a source of pain. But I also learned the power of resilience, of love, and of standing up for myself and my family. Linda had tried to tear us apart, but instead she had pushed us closer together. In the end, we were stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. As I tucked my children into bed one night, they asked me to tell them a story. I smiled, realizing that I was no longer haunted by Linda's shadows. I told them a tale of strength, of courage, and of the power of family. And as I spoke, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We had survived, and we would thrive. The future was ours to shape, and I was ready to embrace it with open arms.